So basically my plan, my loose plan is each week we're going to talk about a different topic. We're going to see how 4 weeks does. If we want to do this longer, if we want to take a couple months and then come back and do this again, I want to be, so this is something I love. This is something we love. We had, so brief biographical story. Sarah and I have known each other since we were 10. We've been best friends ever since. All we ever wanted to do was be parents and raise a family. It's been our great desire. And so we love families, we love parenting, and I want to help you guys. So yeah, we're going to do 4 weeks of this, and like I said, if we want to take June and July off and then come back in August and do 4 more weeks, I would love to do that. Because we're just not going to, if every couple of years we need to come back because the children are totally different in a different stage, I'm totally on board with doing that. So we're gonna give kind of a big overview. Today we're gonna talk about what I think, and what I think the Bible shows as probably the primary foundation for your parenting, apart from just your relationship to Christ. And then we're gonna talk about discipline. What are we gonna talk about besides discipline? Yeah, we have it all written down somewhere. Yeah, we're gonna talk about corrective discipline, and then we're gonna talk about formative, the healthy patterns of life, the healthy family patterns, the healthy habits. So next week we'll start talking about some corrective discipline, and then the week after we're gonna talk about just formative habits. How to build a good just culture of regular patterns of living that really will help your family. And then the last week, I'm sort of holding the last week open for maybe some questions, discussion, and whatnot. So I've got a handout for you guys. So today is actually not a class on parenting. Pass that back to them. Today is a class on marriage. All right. Where does parenting begin in God's design? We're going to look at some passages here. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 29. Because parenting begins in God's design with your marriage and the relationship that you two have together. That's where it starts, and that's the foundation for everything that comes afterward. And so if you don't lay the proper foundation, you're going to struggle with the purpose. One of the purposes of marriage is parenting. But you're going to struggle with that if the marriage itself doesn't have a strong foundation. So Genesis 1:26, so this is the week of creation, and we've come to the point where God is going to make man. And so he says, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the seas and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. We'll just stop there. So at the very beginning, the picture was that God created us. And it says here that he created us male and female. That was the fundamental design, is that you would have a man and a woman who would then together, and this is the key thing, when after he creates them, male and female, God blesses them, male and female. And God said to them, the male and the female, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So here at the beginning, we're going to talk about the different roles in marriage. We're going to talk about what those are for and why those are good and how God designed them. But we can't miss the fundamental fact that whatever the roles are, the big picture is the two together have the task of being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth and subduing it. Together. Now, they're going to have different roles in how they do it, but this was God's fundamental design. So this is the relationship out of which parenting flows. So you can't work it backwards, right? So we've all heard, and you possibly have seen marriages that they only stay together because of the kids. That's working it completely backwards. That misses the fundamental reality that the marriage relationship comes first, and that produces a parenting relationship that honors the Lord. Real quick, flip over, or if you have your Bible out, or you can just listen to me. It's all good. But we are going to move in a lot of Bible passages today. Just warning you. Genesis chapter 2, verses 20 through 25. The man gave names to all livestock and to the birds of the heavens and every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. And then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and not ashamed." So again, we see here this is a partnership together. This is a beautiful picture of God's design. He looks at the man and goes, "That's not going to cut it. It's not good that he's alone. He needs a helper fit for him." Now, why does he need a helper? Because he's already got a job to do. He has a purpose. He has been designed to do something. And so he needs a helper that is fit for doing the work that's in front of him. But it's a beautifully intimate picture here, isn't it? Of the man and the woman becoming one flesh. They become so united. They become so intimately tied together that God would say they're one flesh. They're not two separate entities anymore. The two have become one unique entity. That unique entity is made up of a man and a woman. That's so necessary for parenting. I cannot stress this enough. It's out of this relationship that faithful parenting comes. And if you don't have this relationship, then you're already eroding the most important thing that you can give to your children. So we're gonna flesh this out a little bit. Parenting is a primary function of marriage. I say a primary function. It's not the only function of marriage, right? Marriage exists for much more than this. Marriage exists for one. I mean, it exists for companionship. I have there in your notes, companionship with a purpose. It's not good that he was alone. It's not. He was meant to be together. So companion is like with another, right? There's a companionship. You're meant to be together. The two of you becoming one in all areas of life, subduing the world, creating. These are purposes. The major purpose that Paul gives for marriage is what?
Illustration.
Yeah, reflecting Christ in the church. And so again, you see here, that is all about how the two interact with one another. How the two embrace the roles that God gave them and are faithful in them. And so parenting is a primary, but it's not the only function of marriage. And so again, when you find yourself in a situation where you're going, we're only staying together for the kids, that's a very clear sign that you have lost the true purpose of marriage, right? Marriage is for the glory of God. So the need for the marriage is, it needs to be the center of your family. Whatever else you're doing, you have to be feeding your marriage first and foremost. So the picture we came up with, it's the nuclear reactor of your family. It's what keeps the family powered. It's what keeps the family moving. And if it's unstable, well, you don't want a nuclear reactor unstable, right? It throws everything off. That your relationship with your children is not the nuclear reactor of your family. The relationship that you guys have together as husband and wife, that's the core of your family. And I mean, studies will show this as well, but we don't necessarily need studies. I mean, we have the Word of God here. But it's so fundamentally true. It provides stability. It provides confidence for the children. It provides peace when the parents are clearly united. So, if it's unstable, everything else is unstable. It needs priority. Which means that we need to talk about marriage relationships. Anybody have any comments or questions so far? Anything jump out at you? Sarah, good. You agree with everything I say? You approve of it? Okay, thank you. We're on the same page. Okay, we're going to walk through a few things here that you may already be doing this. Some of you I've just gotten done doing premarital counseling with over the last year, so some of this is going to be a refresher for you. Some of you maybe not. But these are things that I think are absolutely essential parts of your marriage for the sake of your children. And we're going to see why. But also for the sake of yourselves. First off, share a desire to glorify Christ that's above every other desire. James chapter 4, verse 1. What causes fights and quarrels among you, my brothers? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? James talks a lot about the desires that go on in our heart and how sin actually comes from the desires that are happening within our heart. So he's asking the question here, what is it that brings you guys into conflict with each other? Everybody in here, you have been in conflict with your spouse. I know you have. You have had arguments. You have had quarrels together. And so James is trying to analyze this for us and go, what causes that? And at the heart of it, what causes that is conflicting desires. Conflicting desires that have come. This is war language, right? This is battle language. You desire and you do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. And so it's really easy when it comes to your kids to have this happen. Because you will have different desires for your children. It could be as simple as, well, I want my kids to play sports. But you know what? I could care less about sports. I don't want to spend my time doing that. Uh-oh. Guess what? You now have different desires for your children that are going to come into conflict with each other. And they're your children, and so you put a lot of weight on those things, and you're like, but listen, I have always dreamed of having a son that plays soccer. And she's like, I could care less about that. I don't want him out there breaking his leg. And so, I mean, school, how we're going to teach, even if you agree, like, oh, we both agree on homeschooling, but I want to do classical. Well, I want to do, what's the thing that we do, Sarah?
What?
We don't do classical, we do, what is it? We homeschool. We homeschool.
We stopped calling it anything in particular.
We do our own thing.
We melded so many things together.
But some of that came out of conversations where, guess what? We found out pretty quick that we had different desires. And I promise you, you have some different desires about your children. And that can push you guys apart. Because what it does, the picture here is one of war language, right? So I'll use Sarah and myself. The picture here is that I have my kingdom, Kevin's kingdom. And in Kevin's kingdom, I've set up my flag. And everything that's in my domain should go according to my will. In my kingdom, this is what my children will do. In my kingdom, they'll play sports. In my kingdom, they'll read books. In my kingdom, They'll be funny all the time. That's what's going to happen in my kingdom. That's what I desire. That's my expectations. And that's what I've always wanted to see. And so I'm going to work towards that. But the problem is Sarah has her queendom. She has her area too. And she's the queen of it. And she has her flag that she set up. And in her kingdom, they don't play sports. In her kingdom, that's not what they do. They're interested and engaged in other things. And in her kingdom, they want to help people. And in her kingdom, they want to serve others. And I mean, that stuff's all great and everything, but that's not how I was envisioning it in my kingdom, but that's how she envisioned it in her kingdom. And so what's happened is we are now in war talks. Because I'm the ruler of my kingdom, and this is what I want to see happen. She's the ruler of her kingdom. That's what she wants to see happen. But the problem is we're married. The two of us are one. It's not my kingdom and her kingdom. It's our kingdom. And so we're supposed to figure out how to bring this together. What causes the fights and quarrels among us? Our desires. We're at war. They're going to happen whenever your child misbehaves. And one of you goes, I think we need to discipline them right now. And the other one goes, no, not yet. They don't really know what they're doing. Or maybe later. Or, my mom's over and I really don't want to see you. No. There's desires that are... Hey, I know what happens. I've been there. There's desires that are at work in your heart. And they're going to bring you into conflict with each other. One of the best things you guys can do for each other is right now, those of you who don't have kids especially, and those of you who have kids before they get any older, learn how to deal with these conflicting desire moments. Don't run away from them. Don't set up your kingdom, and then what you do is you're like, you know what? My response to you know what it is, I'm going to build a moat. That's how certain I am. This is what I want. I'm not going to give on it. That's not the answer. And we know it's not the answer, but in our pride, that's what we want. And we set up hills to die on that really we don't need to do that. What is James's solution here? You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly. Now, how do you ask wrongly, he says? To spend it on your passions. That's the issue. When we start fighting our battles, when I'm fighting Kevin's battle instead of fighting Kevin and Sarah's battle, and when she's fighting Sarah's battle instead of fighting our battle, when I've set myself up and decided, you know what, on this instance, we're not together. The problem is we are. We just don't know how to be together. So the solution for James, ultimately, is you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? That's how we're acting. We're setting ourselves up as priority. What do we need to do? We need to share the same bedrock desire to glorify Christ. To glorify Christ. That's above every other desire. Most important thing that you guys can cultivate together in your relationship is that whatever else, your great desire is to glorify Christ. Everything else is held loosely. If your spouse can come up with a better way to glorify Christ, then that's what you're going to go with. If your spouse's way is this, it's not any better than yours, but it's not any worse either, then why are you holding on so tightly, both of you? There's got to be a constant feeding that your marriage exists to glorify Christ. Your deepest desire is to bring him honor. Your deepest desire is to put him first. And if you've put sports over that desire, that's idolatry. If you put your mother and her attitude about your children over glorifying Christ, that's idolatry. If you put time, if you put embarrassment over Christ, all of that stuff's idolatry. This is sanctification. This is where learning how to talk about this together, learning how to give grace to each other, because here's the beautiful thing. In Christ, we can give grace. That leads to the second thing here. Communicating in godly ways with each other. So first off, you've got to recognize this. A lot of times what happens in your conflict is you guys have opposing desires. And it's so worth talking about. It's so worth going, hey, honey, we need to step back for a second. I think what's happening is we've got some conflicting desires here. Let's try and step back from this conversation and let's see what's in our hearts. And now Sarah and I can do that together because I trust completely that her desire is to glorify God. How do I know that? Because we've been married, we're coming up on 20 years of marriage. I've seen it. You have to extend some trust in the other person that they're not just going, hey, I'm just going to do this because I want to do this. My way goes. And say, no, let's step back. What are the desires that are driving us? Can we talk about that? But if we're going to do that, we have to be able to communicate in godly ways. I've done a lot of marriage counseling. And I'm going to tell you guys something. And those of you who did the premarital, I told y'all this. I look for bad patterns of communication. And the reason why, you guys are, how long have y'all been married? 4 years. 4 years? Almost. How long have y'all been married?
3.
3 years.
Mm-hmm.
How long have y'all been married?
Almost 5.
Almost 5? Okay, so you guys are the older, experienced ones. They're 5 years. Here's the reality. Like when I sit down and do the premarital counseling, I'm looking for bad patterns of communication, and here's why. Because if you can find them early enough, I know now the reality is bad patterns of communication 10 years into the marriage will kill the marriage, whether there's a divorce or not. I know a lot of marriages that died at about the 10-year mark, and the reason why they died is because there was bad, ungodly, ungraceful communication that had no desire to glorify God. So one of the best things that you guys can do for your marriage is learn how to communicate in a godly way about the desires that you have. Not just about the actions you want to do, but what's the desires that are driving them. Because that's really where the conversation needs to happen with your spouse. Is not just, so early on in our marriage, I did not want to homeschool. I did not want to do it. She homeschooled all her life, and she homeschooled in the 80s, and 80s homeschoolers were super weird. And I went to some of the 80s homeschooler things, and they were I liked her so much, but I would go to some of those things and be like, where am I? This is so weird. Because I was not homeschooled at all. That was one of the first things that we had conflict over. And this was me ultimately, I needed to get down into what was not just I don't want my kids to be weird, but what were the desires going on in my heart? What were the fears maybe that were driving me, that it's like I didn't want my kids to look this way in the sight of the world. I didn't want to risk, And so we needed to be able to get to the level where we weren't just talking about what we want to do, but we were talking about what are the desires that are driving it. And that's where you guys need to be as well. Like when we talk about discipline, it's not just the actions, it's why don't you want to do some things? Or why must it be this way? That's always whenever you find yourself going, I don't know why, but it's gotta be this way, you gotta figure out why. And that's only gonna happen if you're able to communicate. And you're only gonna be able to communicate if you take seriously a couple of passages. Ephesians chapter 4. It gives a great picture in Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 17 there, of the change that happens. Now this I say and testify in the Lord, you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds. They're darkened in their understanding. They're alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. You don't want to be that way. But a lot of times in marriage, it's really easy for us to act that way towards our spouses. We find ourselves in conflict because the relationship you guys have, it's the relationship you have to deal with the most. And your spouse is either going to be the person who supports you the most, or your spouse is going to be the person who gets in your way the most. And that's the truth, because again, even when we could list out 1,000 things, like how are you going to dress your kids? What are you going to teach your kids about the Bible? Are you going to do Bible studies with them? When are you going to pray together? How are you going to eat? Are you guys going to eat dinner together every night? You're not going to eat dinner together. What about letting them go over and have slumber? You see, like literally, there's just with kids alone. I mean, we're not even talking like, what do you spend your money on? What are you going to save up for? Where are you going to go on your trips? The person who's either going to be on your side or against you the most is your spouse on these things. And if you don't learn how to talk about those things in a God-honoring way, that's why 10 years from now, your spouse could be the person who drives you the most crazy because you feel like they've been in your way for 10 years. So, we have to see that we're capable of it. Paul's talking to Christians and he's saying, you used to walk this way. And you have to assume he's talking to Christians because they're still tempted to walk that way. Don't go back to this. You must no longer do that because you've got Christ now. Christ has changed everything for you. He's your life. That's what he says in Colossians 3. He's your everything. Whatever you hold everything else loosely because you've got Christ. So then, what does that mean for your communication? I would encourage you guys, Ephesians 4:25 through 32, and there's going to be another passage that's there in your handout. I would encourage you guys, starting this week, sit down together, walk through this passage, and grade each other and grade yourself. How are you doing in your communication with this stuff? Because we get careless. The reality is, I have spent, if you tagged up my life, I've spent way more than half of it in the company of Sarah. And we have spent so much time together. And we have talked about so many things together. And when that happens, you can get casual with each other in a way that's actually not healthy. And I see this a lot in counseling too, with older couples, where they talk to each other in ways that they would never talk to anybody else. Because they've just let their guard down. But even with Sarah and I, we have learned 20 years of marriage, there are times that we still have to be very cautious and careful and even formal with each other about insensitive conversations so that we can watch over our relationship. Because it could be really easy. She knows all the ways to set me off. She knows every button I have. She knows how to hurt me with just a word. And I know how to do the same thing to her. I know how to hurt her with just a look. And you guys, if you're not there already, you're going to be at that point. Because again, your spouse is the person that you are going to spend the most time with. And so it's really easy for us to let down our guard here. But actually, this is the person that you most want to fulfill this with. So I would encourage you, homework, spend time in this passage and then also in Titus 3. So let's just read it. Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your anger. That is, don't let your anger fester. Don't let it sit. If you guys are in conflict because you have different desires, now it might be totally wise to say, hey, I can't talk about this right now because I'm really upset. That's a reasonable thing. But one of the things that we've learned is what you really should do is you should go, I can't talk about this right now. Could we talk about this maybe at 4 this afternoon? So don't just leave it, because if you say we'll talk about it later, later is a time that doesn't exist. Later is nothing for most people. When you say, I'll do it later, it means you don't want to do it at all, and you're not going to do it until somebody brings it back up to you. So instead of saying later, you go, I can't talk about this right now, but let's talk about it at 4 this afternoon. Let's talk about it tomorrow at breakfast. Let's set a time that we're going to talk about this, and let's prepare our hearts for it. Don't let anger fester. Don't let conflict fester. Give no opportunity to the devil. The devil loves that stuff. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Now you say, how does that apply? Well, I think one of the ways that would apply for us is taking personal responsibility for your role in the marriage. Like you have a personal responsibility to what you have gotten yourself into here. But let no corrupting talk come out of your mouth. I'm going to read that again. Let no corrupting. Scott, I didn't say let some corrupting talk come out of your mouth. Just a little bit's okay. No, Paul said let no corrupting talk. So what's the standard? No corrupting talk. That's really hard to do, but so important. But he doesn't just stop there. He doesn't say Don't let any corrupting talk come out of your mouth. But then he also says, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. You're not doing this for yourself. You're doing this because you've been given Christ. You've been given a higher calling. You've been given the Spirit. So one of the things that we've got to realize is if you've been given the Spirit, you can do this. It is possible for you. Not on your power, but on His. It is possible for you to let no corrupting talk come out of your mouth. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. And then, I want to go ahead and go straight to Titus 2 here. I don't think that was right. Titus 3. That's what I said, right?
3:2-10.
Thank you. Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. Again, Scott, it didn't say to some people. It said all people. And here's the thing, it didn't say give an effort towards courtesy. I've been thinking about this phrase quite a bit because it's kind of a crazy phrase. Show perfect courtesy. It's amazing how often when you build up years of bad habits, then you come and you talk to me about wanting to clean it up. And the way it happens so much is you go, but you don't understand. You don't understand the way He is. You don't understand how He acts. You don't understand what He says. You don't understand what He does. That's why I do this. But that's not what Paul says here, right? You're to show perfect courtesy toward all people, including your spouse. And so I would encourage you guys again, there's some things that you just can't get casual about in your communication. There's some things that you're going to be casual about, right? But when you find yourself in a James 4 situation where you're going, oh, hold up. We've got conflicting desires here. You can't be casual about that. You got to be extra careful. You're walking in a minefield. You're walking in dangerous ground. And you're walking it together. So my premarital counseling folks, they would know this, but it's super vital. I always talk about you need to have a conversation about your conversation. And that conversation about your conversation, if you haven't already started it, it needs to start today and it needs to last the rest of your entire marriage. So we learned this when talking about conflicting desires. Do you want to come up and tell the story? Story time?
So far.
It's conflicting desires right here. What's in your heart, Sarah? The communication. So, yeah, with Ruth.
So when Ruth was 9 months old, we were at church, and I had really big church. So huge nursery. There were 100 kids under the age of 3. So I had built the habit of drop her off for Sunday school, and then after Sunday school, I'd run to the bathroom, and then I'd run back to check on her and see if she was okay. Which technically I wasn't really supposed to even do because they had a door there, and I had to get special permission to go beyond the door, but they let me do it. So this is going on, though. She was 9 months old, and so I forgot to go check on her one Sunday. And we also had the numbered boards, you know, so they could flash our number if she was having a problem and everything. But in the middle of the service, it was right before the sermon started, I was just like, I never checked on Ruth. And it was kind of that, I haven't seen her in so long, I haven't checked on her, you know, I need to go check on her. So I was just like, hey, I'm gonna go check on Ruth. And he was just like, why? My number's not up. And I was just like, no, I need to. It's what I do. I check on her, make sure everything's good, you know, make sure she's napping, all that stuff. And he's just like, no, she's okay. And
which we'd had a couple of weeks of sort of this, like, why do you need to go check on her between the services?
Yeah. I was just like,
why?
it's just what I do. It's what I feel good about doing. It's my responsibility. So he said, no, you don't need to do that today. And I looked at him and I stood up to leave. And he grabbed my hand and just pulled me back down. And I just like felt so many emotions in that moment. Just like, you are stopping me from checking on my baby. This is wrong. You can't tell me I can't go check on her. So just like in that instant, you know, and we had no idea that that conflict was going to come up.
Yeah, we were not
when we
prepared
went to
for that.
church. Yeah, just came out of nowhere.
Well, and if
Not
you notice
really,
something that
but-
she said, you have no right to keep me from going to my baby. Which, when you think about that biblically, that's such an unbiblical statement, right? I have every right. I'm the head of the house, dadgummit. But, I mean, if you had known Sarah then, that's not something that, like, in a normal, you know, just like clinical moment, she would have been like, I don't have the, you know, Kevin is the head of the house. Of course he has the right to do this. But in that moment when I actually stood up, well, sat down and said no, the theoretical went out the window because there was that desire.
So I built up a habit, and it was not the healthiest thing. And then, unbeknownst to me, I also had this desire growing in me, which was my wisdom. You know, my desire for my child kind of trumps what you want in extreme situations.
Yeah.
So we didn't talk about it anymore, and I just got up without him as soon as the service was over, and I went and I got Ruth, and then we walked home quietly together, and then we laid Ruth down, and it got really, really intense, and it was our probably single most like just intense argument we've ever had.
So we had that conflict, right? And at the core of that conflict were really desires. But we didn't know how to talk about that stuff at that point. And so and I was a terrible communicator at that point. And so was she. In very different ways. And so I'm like, what's the deal? Like what happened there? Like why'd you do that? And Sarah's form of
Well, I
communication.
think at first it was, you kept trying to talk to me, and then finally you're like, wait, are you mad at me?
Yeah. and so yeah, I think that was
I don't
something like,
think
wait. And so she's like, yeah, I'm really mad at you. And then I'm like, why? Why are you really mad at me? And here's the thing that just never worked for us at that point. I was the kind of person who was just like, you're mad at me? Let's talk it out. Let's talk it out. What's going on? Explain it to me. But the problem is, I wasn't really a great listener either, though. Like, I was like, I joke, it's like, I've already got 3 points for whatever you're going to talk about. Just tell me what it is, you know? So it's like, you're mad at me. What's the deal? Let's talk this out. What's going on? Why do you think I did something wrong, you know? And so Sarah's like looking at me as I'm doing this. And then her form of communication at that time is get up and walk out. And now, we were like, what, 22? So we've been friends for like 12 years, and I mean, we've been married for like 3 years. I mean, we knew each other really well. This was not the first time that I had been like, what's going on? Come on, talk about it. Give me the reasons. I mean, what are your reasons? Because they're already wrong, and I'm ready to explain why they're wrong. And this was not the first time that she was like, you know what, I'm just going to walk out. But what happened this time was she got up to walk out, and I lost it. And it didn't have anything to do with Ruth anymore. It had to do with the fact that she got up just to walk out. And I'm like, no, you can't just walk. I'm so sick of you just walking away and not talking about this stuff. And she's like trying to walk out, and I'm like behind her, like, no. and then she's trying to, she's crying. She's like, I can't. You're such a jerk. I can't talk to you. Like, all you're gonna do is like you're gonna yell at me, and you're just gonna talk me over. And like, I don't know what to say to you right now. I don't know how to talk to you. I don't know what I'm thinking.
See, you tell this so much better.
But I mean, that's what happened.
It is.
And so what ended up happening next was we sat there like looking at each other, realizing we couldn't get past this point. And we never could. This was like the point that we could just never get past. She didn't know how to communicate the deeply held desires that she had. And I didn't know how to let her do that without telling her what her deeply held desires ought to be. and we didn't know how to get past it. And so she said a lot of things to me about how I never listened, how I just talked over her. She didn't know how to win an argument, because that's what it always was with me. And I didn't even know what we're arguing about half the time because you don't tell me. And I can't read your mind. And a lot of these things came out for hours. It was brutal. It was
a really long time.
But what came from it, and this was just by God's grace, is that we were both able to realize that we had been sinning against each other in not being better communicators. I had been sinning against her and not learning how to listen to her and learning how to actually hear her desires and have the gentle compassion towards her. She had been sinning against me by not even trying to communicate, but by not even trying to put into words and speak the truth in love to me. And we realized we had to do better. And we made a commitment, and literally, it was on that day, we made a commitment that we were going to get better at communicating with each other. And the way we were going to do that is we were going to give priority to our communication. We were going to give priority to learning how the other person communicates. We were going to give priority to allowing each other to basically speak truth. And so I'm going to give you guys a really helpful, practical piece of advice. 98% of the conversations that you have in your married life aren't going to matter. Not in the big scheme of things. 98% of the conversations you have, you won't even remember what they were about. We talked about things back then that were so incredibly important. Life hinged on them. I have no idea what they were. I have no idea. And we fool ourselves into thinking. Even with some of the big things, we're like a job. The reality is, if you don't get this job, you're probably going to get another job. A house. If you don't get this house, you're probably going to get another house. And most of those things don't matter in the grand scheme of things when it comes to parenting and everything else. What God cares about is that you're honoring Him in the covenant relationship you've made together. Communication is the fundamental core of that. So we made a commitment on that day that we were going to have a conversation about the conversation. And we were always going to have it, and that conversation takes priority. So we have agreed, and we've agreed when we come up on something we disagree on. So let me give you an example. When Ruth can start driving by herself. We're just going to open up to you guys. That's a discussion we're having right now together, because we now have a child who has a driver's license. And I think we have some different desires there. And so we're talking about it. And sometimes our desires don't align on when our children can start driving by themselves. But we've made a commitment that in that conversation, she has the freedom at any point to go, time out. We need to step out of this conversation. We need to have a conversation about the conversation. I don't think we're honoring God with the way we're talking about this. And I've committed, if she does that, I've got to stop talking, I've got to stop talking about the driver's license thing, because this is more important. How are we not honoring God? Ephesians 4 is a great guide. Titus 3, great guide. That's what you guys need to cultivate. Y'all need to if you haven't already started, today you need to start the conversation about the conversation. It's a skill. Some of you are going to be different communicators. Some of you need to internalize things before you can talk about them. And the other person would hate that. So what I had to learn is I'm ready to talk about it right now. I was ready to talk about it 15 minutes ago and I didn't even know it existed. But Sarah's not ready to talk about it yet. So what she can't do is go, I can't talk about this with you. But what she can do, and what I need to let her do, is she can go, I can't talk about this with you right now. Could we talk about this tomorrow? Is this something that could wait till tomorrow so I can think about it and prepare to talk to you? And I have to go, yeah, sounds reasonable. I can make it for 24 hours not talking about this. That's no problem. I might struggle with it, but you know what matters more is that we're actually able to communicate. Then there's other times where she's got to give to me and be like, I don't know that I'm ready, but clearly you need to say something right now. So let me hear that. I don't know if I can respond to it, but go ahead and tell me. Let me hear it. So those are the things that you guys need to now, because you're gonna have so many conversations about your kids. You're gonna have so many I hope. If you're not having conversations about your kids, then there is something wrong with your marriage. Because you should be having conversations about your kids. Because you should be in it together. One of the things that, Sarah didn't even realize that she had spent so much time dreaming of being a mom that she had taken ownership of being a mom in a way that was unbiblical. I didn't even realize it was happening, and some of that was on me. I needed to be more engaged in the process. And the fact that I wasn't being more engaged was only encouraging her in a sinful attitude of, I'm actually the one who takes responsibility for this. Listen, so many moms, if they don't even say it out loud, they think it in their hearts. I'm the one who does everything, so I'm the one who should be able to make the decisions on this. Part of that is because dads, we need to be doing more, we need to be engaging more, but part of that is just a reality of we need to be engaging more. So, I want to finish Titus 3. Everything else, don't worry, if you've been looking at this like, oh my gosh, we haven't got to point 2. Everything else goes really fast. This is really important though. I cannot stress how important these two things are. Figuring out that you're actually fighting about different desires and learning how to communicate about them. So important. For we ourselves were once foolish, I'm in verse 3. Disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions, another word for passions is desires, and pleasures, passing our days in malice and envy, hated by others and hating one another. And that's the way that you can act when you start fighting for your kingdom instead of working together. But when the goodness and loving kindness of God our Savior appeared, He saved us. And that was something that really hit us. When you're confronted with your sin, there's a moment together as a couple when you both are looking and you're realizing, oh dang, we both have sinned here. What a wonderful moment to go to the gospel and realize, you know what? Jesus saved you. Sinners. He saved us not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to His own mercy, by the washing of regeneration and renewal of the Holy Spirit, whom He poured out on us richly through Jesus Christ our Savior, so that being justified by His grace, we might become heirs according to the hope of eternal life. It's the last thing I'll say on this, but it leads us into forgiveness. Yes.
Are y'all okay with the kids having pizza?
Oh,
That's an umbrella. That's an umbrella.
Hail.
The grace of Jesus Christ is the umbrella that you guys are under. It's what allows you guys to extend mercy when you really want to fight for yourself. It's what allows you guys when the other person, because again, let's get back to the conflict that you might have. Even on a low level, it can be a war. And we can be cutthroat when it comes to winning a war. We can look for whatever tools that we can get. So let's go back to a conversation about your kids. And I don't know, are you going to let them go and sleep over at somebody's house? And you disagree about it. And you guys give each other your reasons. One thing that you might do is if somebody, one of the, let's say the husband, loses his temper in this, gets frustrated, and acts sinfully, it can be really easy for the wife to then turn and use that as a tool to win the argument. And to go, you see, like you can't even act Christ-like about this. Like, what are your motivations? And then use that as a weapon to get your way. Which will be sinful in and of itself, but you certainly will do it. You'll certainly be tempted to do it in different ways. This is where we've got to realize what Paul said to Titus here. This is what guides everything. If you're sinned against by your spouse, you're ready to offer grace and forgiveness. You know, the reality is, nobody's going to betray you like your spouse is going to betray you. Nobody's going to hurt you like your spouse is going to hurt you. They can't. Nobody else can. Your spouse is going to sin against you, and you are going to sin against your spouse. It's going to happen. It's going to be ugly. You're going to feel shame. You're going to feel hurt. You're going to feel anger. Those things are all, if they haven't happened yet, they're 100% going to happen. And the hardest thing in the world to do is to remember that you're living under this umbrella of God's grace, to remember that Jesus Christ has already forgiven your spouse for this. Jesus Christ has already said, there is therefore no condemnation against them. And you're going to be like, Lord, I kind of want to push him out from under the umbrella. He needs condemnation on this one. But that's not your right. You guys are under the umbrella there together. And so instead, what that does is that pushes you to forgiveness. The couples that are quick to forgive each other are couples that are giving life to each other. Now, there's obviously a difference between forgiveness and holding accountable, right? We can understand that. A woman who continually sins in the same way and just simply asks for forgiveness, that's a pattern of sin that needs to be addressed. Right? That's a pattern of sin that ultimately, I think, leads to church discipline and a greater accountability. So we're not talking about that. But what we are talking about is, instead of using your spouse's sin as a weapon to win an argument, you're ready and quick to forgive. Why? Because you've been forgiven. We can't ever forget that. It gives so much life. Forgiving each other, building each other up. Again, you're going to be tempted, especially when you're at that desire level, right? And you really, really didn't want to get your child on a sugar diet. And he continually goes, when they go out together, it's great that they go out, like they go to the dump together, whatever, that's great. But do you have to keep buying the candy bars? You're going to be tempted to tear each other down about certain things. And you're going to be tempted to use language that destroys. Because again, the hateful thing about us is when we get into a war, we grab whatever tools are available to hand. And corrupting talk is a wonderful tool. You always do this. Well, you know what? That's because you're always like this. You know you don't have any self-control. Well, this is just like what you did this time, all over again. Am I missing any other examples that I can think of?
I missed what you're giving.
No, building up instead of tearing down. Using corrupting talk as a tool that you can use. And again, you get to the point, I know the corrupting talk that would leave Sarah just a bundle of frustrated, upset, I could get my way. And she knows the same thing for me. She knows what would get me to just go sit in my room and just stare at a corner because I'm just so frustrated and upset. We could use those as tools against each other. Can't do that. Work together. So that goes back to Genesis 1:26 through 29. Understanding God's design. God's design is not for the husband, not for the father to run the house and everything is just, he's running it by fiat. No, he said male and female, we created them. And then he spoke to them. It's the two of them together. If the husband is running everything and not including the wife in it, he's not honoring the Lord, and vice versa. If the wife is running everything and not including the husband in it, no, this has got to be a joint operation. Now that could look different depending on the couples, right? And it'll look different depending on your children. Here's a hard truth. Your children are going to gravitate to one of you more than the other. That's really common. I mean, that's pretty much the way it is. Doesn't mean that they don't like the other person, but this has been a frustration for us. We'll say child X. Child X gravitated towards me 100%. Child X will say everything to me. And whatever I say to child X, they take it to heart, they love it, and they do it. Do you know how much that frustrates her? It frustrates her a lot. Child Y Well, child Y kind of does their own thing. We're not really sure who child Y gravitates to, and that frustrates both of us. Child Z gravitates directly to her. I'm not even sure that child Z knew I existed until like the last couple of years. It hurts. That hurts. But you know what? Whether they realize it or not, we're in it together. Child Y is our child, not just mine. It doesn't matter whether that child gravitates to me. A child is our child. Same with child B who gravitates to her. Or I forgot their lips. I'm just throwing out random letters now.
How many kids do we have?
We have to be committed, though, that the design that God gave is the two of you together. Whether the child really, that's what they want, it doesn't matter. That's what they need. Fulfill your roles with each other. We're going to hold off a little bit on this for another day, getting a little bit more deeply into this, but I'm just going to throw it out right now. Wrestling with how does the wife submit? When should the husband lead against the wife's wishes? That's a really important thing for you guys to grow in understanding. If you're struggling with that, Sarah and I would always be happy to get dinner. I mean, that's a hard thing. It's a hard thing. It's not cut and dry. What is cut and dry is that the husband holds responsibility before the Lord for the decisions that are made in the family. What is cut and dry is that the wife is to submit to the husband. How that looks is not always cut and dry. Sarah and I would be happy at any time to get dinner and talk more with you about your particular relationship with that. But you guys need to be talking about it as well. One thing that's on here just practically is the husband, the guy, must be engaged. It is a real temptation, guys, especially in our society. So it's kind of interesting. We're going to talk about Deuteronomy 6 here in just 2 seconds. But Deuteronomy 6 has this picture of the husband, the father's with his children. Because when you think about it in that society, so often the children were following the father's footsteps, whether it was whatever he was doing, working on the farm. The kids were spending a lot of time with the father. In our day, we've sort of disintegrated that part of the family relationship, and the father is off by themselves much of the day, and the mother is managing the day-to-day with the children. And that's really a product of our culture. We've got to fight against that. We have to fight against it hard. Because what that does, there's a part of that we like. Dads, there's a part of it that you like. It's easier to pass this off to your wife. You don't get it. And believe me, you're gonna get into some weird, hard, disciplined conversations with your kids. And she's like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to deal with this. It's gonna happen. Husbands, you gotta be engaged. And wives, it's super important to encourage. I used that word very, very carefully. Encourage. Let no corrupting talk. This is, guys, I'm just going to be real with you. This is where the wife would have some justifiably corrupting talk for most men. You're not here all day. You're not the one that's dealing with, there are things that you can say that would be totally true, but will not help in coming together. And so needing to be honest about that is a very big difference between Sarah coming to me and going, I'm struggling with the fact that you're not here all day, and we need to figure out how to do this better. And her going, well, you just don't know what I'm dealing with. You're not here all day. I'm the one who, how dare you? You don't even know the situation. Those are two very different ways to approach the same topic. And so that's something that maybe you guys need to have conversations about now in talking about. Okay, last thing on this. Both must learn how to encourage and exhort. Hebrews 3:12, exhort one another every day as long as it is called today, so that you may not be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Your great calling in your marriage is not to parent your children. Your great calling in your marriage is to become more like Christ. Husbands, your great calling is to make your wife more like Christ. Wives, your great calling is to make your husband more like Christ. You do not want your spouse to be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. So you have to learn how to both encourage, build up, but also in encouraging and building up, and without corrupting talk, you have to learn how to exhort each other. You have to learn how, so this is something I would encourage you guys, if you're having a conversation about the conversation. Husbands, you need to think, How can your wife exhort you? How can your wife look at you and go, you're in sin and you need to become more Christ-like? And then you need to help your wives to know how to do that for you. Wives, same thing. You need to go to your husbands and you need to tell them, I need you to exhort me. I know I'm a sinner. And then you guys need to talk about how you can exhort each other. It's a very sensitive issue. Nobody likes to be told they're sinners. This is again where one of the quickest responses I guarantee that you'll have. You have this conversation, you go, so Olivia goes to Larry and goes, Larry, I want you to tell me when I'm sinning. And I want you to be kind, I want you to be gentle, I want you to go, honey, I have noticed this area in your life where I do not think you're bringing glory to God. That's how I want you to do it. And he goes, okay, I'll do that. And so then the next day, Larry comes to Olivia and he says, honey, I think this is an area where you're not bringing glory to God. And Olivia goes, yeah, well, this is an area where you're not bringing glory to God. That's what we want to do. So honestly, that would be another thing to talk about is, you need exhortation. One of the best things you guys can do for each other is talk about how to give it. How to give it. And then how to call each other out when you're not accepting it. It is, in my mind, even though Olivia was totally right, this is an area that Larry also fails in. She didn't say that because she wants Larry to be more Christ-like. She said that. I'm sorry, I'm putting words in your mouth. She said that because she wants to deflect and she wants to get the attention off of herself. Right? That's why she said it. Even though she's right. And so what happens then is Larry, he's like, well, dang, you're right. Well, what do we do now? We're both sinners. Maybe that's true, and maybe that's what you need to come away with. But what you can't do is you can't deflect back on the person instead of owning your own sin. You have to accept that, and this is going to come to communication and trust. You have to accept that your spouse wants you to become more like Christ. It is a hard thing. It is still a hard thing for me to go to Sarah. It is so hard for me to go to Sarah and go, I think this is an area where you need to look at your heart. I'm worried about how she's going to respond to that. And so she needs to encourage me in doing that. Thank you. I will think about that. And we'll talk about it. So learn how to encourage and exhort each other. Learn how to call each other out in godly ways. And that's going to be different for different people. It really is. You need to understand how you, and being honest, how you best could be encouraged and exhorted, and then ask for it and take it. Any questions about any of that? I know that was a lot. Yeah, Gary.
You mentioned some examples that are almost like so well known that like you always do that. Like you could see that on a TV show or a movie or just, and we all know it probably in our households too. And the opposite of that is the building up as fits the occasion, right?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, do you know of any good examples that, like, when they're said sincerely, that have just worked well to
build up?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're really bad about thanking. We are really bad about thanking our spouses regularly. Building up a habit of being thankful. And then honestly, we can be bad at just basic complimenting. We can be really bad about noticing and recognizing. When you really think about it, it takes a lot of intentionality to sit down and go, like, you're seriously doing a great job at this. And be specific, not just you're doing a great job today, but really sit down and go, I want to tell you how you're doing a great job. I want to tell you, I saw you with Zeke, and the way you handled it, especially your patience, that was great. So I think being thankful, but then I think specific complimenting is a huge bonus. recognizing the good that people are doing. Because otherwise it feels like you're only picking out the bad things. And that can just be really heavy constantly. But I mean, how much better? So your dad said something in a Groove Devo a few weeks ago that I still just thought about. This picture of when you think something nice about somebody and then you don't say it, it's like wrapping up a Christmas present for somebody and then not giving it to them. How much better would it have been if you had just gone ahead and said the thing that you were thinking? So I think that's a huge way of building up. Do you have anything else you'd add?
No, I just, I think making it a habit to say the positive things that you're thinking.
Yeah.
We've had, I was sitting here trying to formulate it in my mind, but I couldn't quite get there. But we've had arguments that have broken out because I came to Kevin to try and lovingly point something out, and it came at the wrong time. He deflected, but then he came back with this hurt, like something that he assumed I meant by what I was saying. I know this is kind of vague, but if I had only all along been saying, I can't believe how amazing you are at providing for our family, as an example, we would have never had that argument when I'd come to him about this tiny little sin, that I had seen and wanted to exhort him in. If I had all along been saying, thank you so much for working so hard for our family, and just, I know you're so tired this week, so I wanted to do this for you just to say thank you. Just little things like that. You're planting a garden there of just joy and peace, and if you don't plant anything, nothing good's going to grow out of it.
Well, and if you think about it, we're just like, one of the dumbest things that we all do is we all assume. Oh, I figured you knew that. Well, I don't know if this works the other way, but I think one of the most powerful things that Sarah ever came to understand is I have no idea what she's thinking, and I'm really dumb. And we had the conversation where I was like, you just have to tell me what I'm thinking. No, you have to tell me what you're thinking. Sometimes you have to tell me what I'm thinking. But I was like, you cannot assume I know what's happening in this situation and then get hurt by what you assume I know and I'm not acting on when I really didn't even know it in the first place. If I knew it and I wasn't acting on it, then be mad at me. But if you've assumed I thought something and then had an entire conversation in your head about this thing that you assumed I thought when I had no idea was happening, that's not my fault. But I think also it's like, going back to the building up, if you were to look at your conversations together and you were to go, what is the percentage of critiquing to building up that happens in our communication? Imagine for most, when you really come down to it, that number is going to be really high on the critiquing end for most people. Because they think the only time we really need to communicate is when there's something wrong. But how much easier would it be to communicate the things that are wrong if the majority of the things you talk about are actually building up? And so I thought of another example, and then I can move on. Not just the speaking, but recognizing what really does build up. So, for instance, I talk a lot, and I can dominate conversations, and I know that about myself. I know that because Sarah's told me that about myself. I know now that what builds her up is that I shut my mouth and I ask her to talk instead. Because that's not natural for me. What builds her up is that when she starts on something, I don't cut in and take over the conversation. What builds her up is when I turn and I ask her, what do you think? So it's learning those kind of things. It's like, you probably do things that unintentionally don't lift up your spouse. Learning what those things are. It builds up Sarah so much when I go, I'm gonna stop talking, I wanna hear from you. I wanna hear what you think about this. And I'm actually gonna sit here and listen. So things like that too. Any other comments, questions before we get to the end of this? I know I'm going a long time. All right. When a marriage looks like the above, then you can actually begin fulfilling God's design for raising children. So when your marriage functions that way, when you've got the fruit of good communication, then Deuteronomy 6:6-7, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, you're doing more than just telling your kids. You're telling them and you're showing them by living it out in front of them. You're showing them what it looks like to be patient, what it looks like to be kind, what it looks like to handle conflict, what it looks like to disagree. So that's so much more powerful. One of the things you're going to learn is that your children are not going to do what you say. Your children are going to do what you do. You're going to see your children, and the way you respond to stress is going to be the way they respond to stress. The way you respond to conflict is the way they're going to, because they're watching what you do. So if you live it out faithfully, they're going to pick up on that, 100%. So I got 2 quotes here. One is from Stuart Scott and Martha Peace in the book The Faithful Parent. It says, change must begin with the parent. Our children need to see in our lives daily what we want to see in theirs. Really good. Our children need to see in our lives daily what we want to see in theirs. And then Rachel Yankovic says, as you deal with your children, deal with yourself always and first. This is what it looks like and feels like to walk as a parent with God. And this is really helpful advice. As you deal with your children, deal with yourself always and first. Your children are they're gonna be a conflict. You're gonna come in conflict with your children. Psalm 145, 4-7. One generation shall commend your works to another and shall declare your mighty acts. On the glorious splendor of your majesty and on your wondrous works I will meditate. They shall speak of the might of your awesome deeds, and I will declare your greatness. They shall pour forth the fame of your abundant goodness and shall sing aloud your righteousness. That's what we want to see. And in order to see that happen, we need to experience that change in ourselves. And our marriage needs to reflect that. How can you talk to your children about obedience if they can see your consistent disobedience in your own life and in your own relationship to each other? Right? So all of you guys, the big battle right now is the battle of the will between you and your children. Or if you don't have children, it's the first big battle that you face, is the battle of the will. Your child was born with a rebellious heart. That's what it's deceitful above all things. It's desperately wicked. It's set against God. But the greatest thing that you can teach your children is that there's an authority over you that's good. There's an authority over you that is worth submitting to. But if they're watching you and they're hearing you read Bible stories about being kind to one another, and then they see you being unkind, they're reading Bible stories and you're reading Bible stories to them about trusting God, and then they don't see you trusting God. Why would they obey you if you don't obey God? That doesn't make any sense. That's a challenge for us, isn't it? You cannot resist your opportunities to be corrected by God and then expect them to receive correction from you. That's a great quote. So then, the best foundation for parenting is to be a faithful marriage, and as a husband and wife, to pour yourselves into having a faithful and obedient marriage. We've gone a long time. I know that I went for forever, so I can actually stop there this week and we can pick up. Not every one of them is going to be this long. Actually, after this one, I'm hoping that they're going to be a little bit more interactive. But this one, really important. I cannot stress enough, speaking biblically, pastorally, and experientially. Parenting all depends on the two of you having a faithful, godly marriage. Now, does that mean that you could have a bad marriage and you end up with bad children? Not necessarily. I mean, ultimately, God is the one who is at work. But if we're going to live out God's design is marriage that leads to faithful parenting. So the challenge this week is your marriage comes first. Start the conversation about the conversation. Talk to each other about how you can exhort each other. Start trying to have the conversation about the desires that are going on when you guys come into conflict. What's driving that? I've got 2 books, so they're the recommended books, but honestly, guys, marriage is a skill set. It blows my mind that we go, you've got to go to school to get into this career. You've got to get training to learn to do this. You got to go through this interview process, because we recognize that those things, they take skill. And then we're like, oh, the 2 of you love each other. You should get married. You're going to do fine. Oh, you're going to be so sweet together. That's dumb. That's not how it works. It's a skill. It's work. So these 2 books, I know I said recommended, but guys, you really need to read these 2 books together. Marriage, 6 Principles, or 6 Commitments. I don't even have it on. You guys have it written there. But Paul Tripp's book on marriage, he changed the name recently. You guys need to read that book together. That book walks through a lot of what I talked about today, just the practical reality of building healthy patterns of communication and Christ-centeredness. And then the other one there, When Sinners Say I Do. Hugely important for talking about how the gospel actually impacts your marriage. What it is to be sinners, but then to do that in a way that relies on Christ. Y'all really need to read both of those books. It'll help your marriage, and helping your marriage will help your parenting. Any questions? Comments? You have anything? All right, that's it. That's all I got. Next week we'll segue. On your handouts, does it have something on the back about success?
Yep. Yes.
That's what we're going to pick up next week. We're going to talk about, because really it probably belongs there, because when we think about corrective discipline, we're thinking about what do we want to see happen with our kids, and what do we want to mold them into and shape them into. So think about this question this week. I want 2 different answers here. You can give me your Sunday school answer, and that's totally fine. But I want the honest answer as well. How would you define being successful as a parent? Now, if you're sitting there and you're going, well, I know what the right answer to this is, then maybe the question would be, how do you struggle with defining success as the right answer instead of defining the success as something else? So think about that this week, because that'll be huge. All right.